get ready to thrive loud with Lou Diamond.
Hey, Thrive Loud fans, Lou Diamond here. Every now and then, we have the good fortune of having an amazing guest who has an absolutely awe-inspiring story. Today would be one of those episodes. Darnell Epps has an amazing story. I interviewed him on the Fresh from the Hill podcast for Cornell University, and you will hear something a little different about someone who truly rebounded from a life-changing event that took him out of society for quite some time. Sit back, relax, and listen to someone's journey that will truly inspire you that no matter what happens to you and whatever road you may go down, there is a path back. And I think you'll all be inspired by his personal journey and where he will continue to head on to as Darnell Epps shares his story here on Thrive Loud. Welcome to another episode of Fresh from the Hill, inside stories of noteworthy Cornellians. My name is Lou Diamond, CEO of Thrive, host of Thrive Loud, class of 92, proud supporter of the Big Red, and your host of today's episode. Today on Fresh from the Hill, we are bringing things to an unbelievable level because we are going to share a story of an incredible Cornellian who is still on the Hill. But his experiences, I think, will resonate with everyone that's recently left, those that are there, and those that haven't been there in quite some time. We will be speaking today with Darnell Epps, a man whose journey has taken him from a maximum security prison to an Ivy League college at Cornell University. Darnell, how are you today?
How are you? I'm doing well. Middle of finals like every other Cornellian right now who hasn't graduated. So just, looking forward to the summer vacation and connecting with family down in NYC once the semester's done.
So I got to tell you, well, we are recording this, as you said, right during finals time here in May. And needless to say, it's a lovely, balmy 40 degrees in Ithaca and raining. Yeah. So everyone's enjoying themselves trying to study, which is it's ideal for studying for your final exams. So our community here wants to hear this story. I'll share with all the listeners that this story came to me from our producer who shared with me your journey, Darnell, and I think it probably bodes well for you to share it. So where I really want to start is maybe in your high school years or growing up and exactly how that led to the path that took you in a different direction that you probably weren't planning on.
Well, quite a lengthy story, but I to give full context, I'll go into my early childhood years. I grew up in the housing projects in Brooklyn. I was raised initially in a two-parent household with my mother, Denise, and my father, Darrell. And I had three brothers, one older brother, Darrell. And my mother had Darrell and I at the ages of 16 and 17, respectively. So she was quite young when she had Darrell and I. And most of my early childhood, everything was great. I went to a Catholic school. We lived in a neighborhood where, a lot of our neighbors were working class or living below the poverty line. But my father, he was a taxi cab driver, and he had mustered up enough savings to send us to a private school where my brother and I were really like the only minority students at the school, Resurrection.
And which school was this? Which private school were you at that point?
Resurrection in Garrison Beach, Brooklyn.
Got it. Okay.
And it was a great experience. But admittedly, I never really seen myself as an academic when I was young. I played a lot of sports. I'm a tall guy. I'm currently, 6'6", and I weigh 260 pounds. So I would play a lot. When I was young, I was tall and I was big, and I would play a lot of football and basketball. And I always seen myself going to college. If I ever went to college, it was through an athletic scholarship. But I never really seen myself as an academic. And, during my early years, when I reached my early teens, my parents, had divorced. And, it was a quite an experience for Darrell and I. And my father, by that time could no longer afford to pay the tuition, which went up at Resurrection. So we had to go to a New York City public school,
Mm-hmm.
which was kind of a shock. I went from wearing a uniform to school and being an altar boy to then going to a underperforming New York City public school at the sixth grade level. And, it was a different kind of experience from what I went through in private school. Would see fights, would see, somewhat the teachers were somewhat more indifferent. And it was kind of a zero tolerance policy when it came to disciplining students. So you see a lot of expulsions, a lot of suspensions.
Yeah.
So it was very much a different environment. Never really put a premium on what kind of clothes I wore to school, but when you go to public school, it's different. You're not wearing a uniform, so you want to fit in and you want to get the newest, clothes. And my parents didn't have much at that time. My father, again, he wasn't earning enough at that time to really provide all four boys the type of clothing that we had wanted. So we made do with what we had. I still continued to play sports, but during the point in which my parents separated when I was about 14, my brother Darrell had already went down the wrong path and found himself in a juvenile detention facility,
Mm-hmm.
for selling drugs, right? So he was 15 years old. He 14 months older than me, and he found himself serving 15 months in a juvenile detention facility in Lincoln Hall.
Yep.
And it was kind of a difficult thing for me to deal with because I always had my older brother there with me, and then all of a sudden he's gone. And my younger brother Jonathan, he was 4 years younger than me at the time, and then I had my younger brother Willie, who was 8 years younger than me. And so I was dealing with that, and eventually I began when my parents separated, ultimately divorced. My mother took custody of my two younger brothers, and she moved to a better neighborhood in Brooklyn. She ended up becoming a New York City police officer, actually.
Okay.
And moved out. And Darrell and I stayed with my father in the same Brooklyn housing project. And eventually, my freshman year in high school, I began to not attend every class, even though I was playing on the football team, and ended up failing two majors and a minor, which made it so that I couldn't play football, right? And
Right.
that was really the only thing that kind of connected me to school at that time was sports. So when the coach gave me the option of, continuing with the team, but not playing until I worked on getting my grades up, I made the incredibly stupid decision of not going to school anymore, right?
Okay.
And I dropped out in the 10th grade. I dropped out of school, and I found myself very much influenced by my surroundings. My high school was right across the street from the projects that I had lived in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. So, I kind of thought it was too late for me to really do anything after a couple of years when I'm 17, I'm 18, and I see, friends of mine, some of whom I grew up with go off and go to community college, or some go to state colleges. And I just thought like my time had passed, right?
Darnell, before you go there, what were you doing when you dropped out?
Well, I began to smoke weed. I began to sell drugs. I began to do, find a way to make money. And this was something that my father, he had battled addiction, right? So it was, I witnessed it in the home, which was one of the factors that, kind of led to, the eventual divorce. And it affected me in a way that, I can't even begin to explain, but I felt like I didn't really have the father there I had remembered when I went through, private school and he was the coach of the football teams. I kind of seen him, um, you know, go into go on a different path, which was sort of, I guess, looking back now, maybe somewhat traumatizing, right?
Yeah.
But I found, um, I found support amongst the wrong crowd in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And on a night that eventually, so I was out smoking weed, doing foolish stuff that kids in my neighborhood were doing at that time. And I found myself on the night that this incident happened with my brother. Um,
And your brother was back from juvenile detention at
yes,
this point. Yeah. Okay.
yes. To put it, give you a better time frame. Yeah, my brother had served 15 months in Lincoln Hall, and he had returned at the age of say 16, and he was accepted to John Jay College. He got his GED he earned his GED while he was in Lincoln Hall, and he was considering going to college at that young age, and he ultimately decided not to. He again went back into the streets,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't bode well for him. And I was in it as well, right? So my mother had my two younger brothers and moved out of the
Right.
those projects, and so yeah.
So at this point, your brother was out. You were there. Why don't you share with the listeners the actual incident that took place so we can understand the actual facts that happened so they understand?
Well, on the night in question, my brother's wife, who was pregnant, 6 months pregnant at the time, was the victim of a sexual assault by a gang member in the neighborhood. And my brother decided to confront this individual who was years older than us, who had a reputation in the neighborhood for violence. And my brother decided to confront him. My brother was armed with a weapon. And I accompanied my brother there, and I myself was armed. And things escalated. They struggled over the weapon, and my brother was wounded, and the man was wounded as well, fatally. And I found myself before a judge in the Brooklyn Supreme Court looking at a potential life sentence and never getting out of prison. I was charged as an accessory uh, to my brother's conduct, even though I didn't physically inflict any harm on anyone. I was still charged as an accomplice and held liable for my brother's actions.
And what was the sentence at that particular time that you were put?
I was sentenced to 17 years, 17 and one half years to life. My brother took full responsibility for the offense. He pled guilty and said, my younger brother had nothing to do with it. And, he didn't know what my intent was. And the judge was sympathetic to my brother's claims, and he wanted to give me a lesser sentence. And so he offered me 15 straight years, which was a determinate sentence. And it was for a manslaughter charge. And I declined it because I felt like I didn't have any intent to cause a harm to anyone at that particular moment. And I was just at the scene with my brother, and I didn't really understand the legal implications of that. And so I declined the plea offer and decided to go to trial. And typically, when someone goes to trial, you face the maximum sentence. Like if you're convicted,
Right.
the judge often gives you the maximum penalty, which in my case, if I was convicted on all counts, the weapons charge, as well as the accomplice liability charge, I would have been facing up to 40 years to life in prison. And the judge decided not to give me the maximum sentence, imposed a sentence of 17 and one half years to life in prison, which was the same sentence that my brother received through a negotiated plea bargain.
Right.
So my brother was already sent to a maximum security prison. He was already at 5 Points Correctional Facility in Romulus, New York, at the time that I was being tried before a jury.
So Darnell, at this particular point, how old were you and how old was your brother?
I was 20 years old and Darrell was 21 at the time.
Okay. So, and both sent away and where were you sent to?
Well, I was sent to Five Points Correctional Facility in Romulus, New York, which initially um, it was just built. It was a brand new correctional facility in New York State, and they were trying to fill all these open bunks that they had. Often it's the case that relatives or co-defendants won't end up in the same correctional facility for security reasons. But in this situation, my brother, he was already there, and they were trying to send as many people as they could to Five Points Correctional Facility to fill up all these available beds. So I ended up by chance at that facility as well, which was kind of a bittersweet feeling. I was happy to see my brother, yet we were both sad that we were serving such lengthy sentences.
Darnell, let me just ask this important question here, and I know it's a tough one to go back to. Give me your frame of mind and your perspective on life at that point when you were going in. Was it hatred? Was it frustration? It felt like there was no end and unfairness? What did you personally feel as this was taking place to you?
I mean, for me, I felt tremendous sorrow. I felt sorrow for, the victim's family. I felt sorrow for the tremendous pain that I caused to my own family. And I felt, I felt I felt like something had to change, that my outlook on life, my outlook on family, my outlook on community, I felt like those things had to change. I knew something was flawed about my way of thinking, and I had to stop thinking about myself and start thinking about how my choices affect other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started coming to this kind of understanding of what it is to be socially responsible incrementally through this process, from being sentenced and then being transferred upstate. And I didn't know what would come of my future. I mean, it wasn't something I did to eventually be paroled or anything. I didn't even know that I would ever get out. I mean,
Right.
when I was sentenced, only 3% of violent offenders made their first parole board in New York State, a very low percentage. I mean, I remember going up when I was first transferred upstate, and I would see a lot of older inmates in the yard discussing how they were denied parole 5, 6 times, and each time parole would deny their release, they would hold them for an additional 2 years beyond the minimum sentence. So in most of these cases, the inmates were serving sentences of, say, 15 to life, 20 to life, but yet were denied parole 5 or 6 times, which could have extended their sentence by 10 or 12 years. And it didn't look like some of them would ever get out. So I see these older inmates aging in prison, and a lot of them had great disciplinary records. They had, a college education at a time when college was quite common in New York State correctional facilities until the Clinton crime bill eliminated Pell Grants for people who are incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
So this was that older population that I was seeing when I first entered the prison system at the age of 20, and I had never been in prison before. So it was a scary thing, but yet, not knowing what I would encounter. But yet I knew that I had to grow, right? And I had a brother there as well for support through this situation.
Darnell, I'll ask this question. What year was this that this took place when you first arrived?
2000, the year 2000.
Okay. So we're at 19 years ago. When you arrived into 5 Points, and as you started to recognize your road back on improvement and trying to think about others versus yourself, obviously hitting the low point at that point, who within the walls there helped you on that path? Who helped you with education, who helped you learn and change maybe not only your perspective, but also improve as a human being and think about how you think of things differently when you were in 5 Points?
Um, there were multiple people who contributed to my eventual growth. There were the older inmates, Bar Kim, who I came upstate with, or Mark Thompson eventually, who came to 5 Points, and others, inmates, older inmates who had played quite a role in helping to, keep my brother and I from the criminogenic environment in prison. And we realized that we had options, right? That we didn't have to succumb to gangs. We didn't have to succumb to the negativity of prison, which which you can find if you're looking for it. So we knew that there was a different experience, right, within the walls of the correctional facility. And, that experience involved volunteerism, it involved youth counseling, it involved working, with civilians, and also furthering our education. I had teachers like Miss Benedetti, who my first year coming to 5 Points had seen, I don't know, had confidence in my ability to be a great student and help encourage me to, pursue my GED. And I earned my GED that first year. And, that helped build my confidence, right? I said I'd never really seen myself as an academic. I guess I started to really understand that I was smart, and not just capable of playing sports at
Darnell.
that time.
Yeah, Darnell, something interesting here that is weird. Your experience growing up in Brooklyn, where you had the opportunity to go to a private school growing up at one part, obviously led you in one direction, and that changed due to the circumstance with your parents. And obviously the environment and the choices out there were different. And as you said so wisely, that's the neighborhood and what you went to and chose to do at that point in time.
Right.
And whether those choices were not enough, but here you are inside the walls. And like you said, you can choose to go into any direction you want, good or bad. What I guess was the impetus behind you to want to improve yourself versus keeping things the status quo when you were there?
I mean, one thing that struck me deep was seeing the pain. When I was in the courtroom, when I walked in the courtroom, and I would see a packed courtroom, and I would see families on both sides feeling pain. I would see the tears in my mother's eyes, the embarrassment that I caused her, the shame that I brought. She was a New York City police officer, but yet had to explain to her colleagues that her two sons were incarcerated for murder. And she was at trial every day, right? She stuck by me. She came up on the visit practically every month to see Darrell and I. And it was witnessing that, it was seeing that, that really brought me face to face with, the need to ultimately become a responsible adult, right? And to break out of this way of thinking that seemed to dominate my teenage years. And for many reasons, it dominated my teenage years. Very much it's a slippery slope, right? You could be a high school student in Brooklyn growing up smoking weed, right? And you have no way of supporting that. So what do you do to support your habit? Eventually you start selling weed or you start selling some other drug, and then eventually when you involve yourself in drug activity, violence becomes, in the inner city and urban areas, violence is very much a part of that in some respects, right? And I never considered myself to be a violent person at all, right? I was always even keel, had a good temperament. I never, seen myself as a violent person, and you could want to avoid it, and you could find yourself having to deal with it in some fashion or another. And that very much explains the night, that involved the altercation between my brother and the gentleman that I mentioned. So yeah, I mean, it's a very slippery slope. It wasn't like, it was something like Darrell and I just dived right into this this behavior. You know, it was something that eventually just crept up and you know, seemed to take a larger role as we grew older, you know.
So in your time inside, did your brother share that same desire to want to improve himself as well?
Yes, he did. He did. And part of it, you know, we were very much accountability partners. I mean, we lucked out with being at the same correctional facility in Five Points, but we were also um, in the same dorm on Rikers Island. And we pretty much both agreed that we had to change. We both came to this agreement. We both sat beside the bed, you know, in our dorms and discussed it and prayed about it. And my brother, you know, eventually became a chaplain's clerk at Five Points, and you know, he's very spiritual. He found faith helped guide him through his journey as well as it did with me. And my brother came to that agreement with me early on, you know, when we came up. And again, it had a lot to do with many people. You know, my brother chaired the youth assistance program from a very young age, probably at about the age of 23. So he was very young, and he was running that program at Five Points. And he was also, you know, again, heavily invested in the church and Protestant church, and he found faith as his guide early in those early years.
And Darnell, I'll ask this question: what did you find faith in?
I found faith in the church as well. My you know, I wasn't the great orator that my brother was, so I wasn't the preacher, but I attended services every day. And chaplain Reverend Stewart, who was the chaplain at Five Points Correctional Facility, was very instrumental in my own coming of age and Darrell's coming of age as well. He eventually retired in 2008, and then another Protestant chaplain took over, Bishop Ronald Dewberry, who also picked up where Reverend Stewart left off, and seen, you know, seen something in my brother and I that they felt, you know, could carry over in, you know, in some fashion into being good people on the outside. And they very much helped shape our way of thinking as well, right?
Yeah. So
they were people we can lean on for advice.
Yep. So Darnell, we could do a whole podcast on your time inside, but I want to get to how you came out and what happened next. So first of all, give a how long were you in prison?
Well, I was in prison for nearly 17 years. Eventually, Darrell and I were eligible for parole in 2016 due to a bill called a limited new piece of legislation that was signed into law in 2009 called limited credit time allowance under the correction law, which allowed us to be eligible for parole release 6 months earlier than usual. So I didn't actually have to serve out the full 17-year minimum term. I served roughly 16 and a half years before going to the parole board. And Darrell and I went to the parole board on the same day in November of 2016. And then there were 18 other inmates who went to the parole board that day. And only Darrell and I were paroled, which was, you know, shows you the likelihood of getting out of prison early on parole in New York State.
So you get out, and at this point, I'm doing some math here. You're about 36 years old?
I was 37 when I was paroled.
Okay. Yeah. And your brother 1 year older at 38.
Yes.
Now you're on parole, and where and how, let's go through the steps.
Okay.
Where did you go to next?
Well, yes. So I was going to be paroled to Brooklyn, New York, initially, because that's the general rule, that you're paroled to the county where the crime was committed. But in my case, my family, my mother had moved out of Brooklyn, right? And my younger brother John, was a police officer in Brooklyn, and I couldn't be paroled to his residence because he has a firearm in the house. So parole would not allow that, obviously. So my hope was to go to Ithaca, right, and to try and finish my education at Cornell, because I had began taking college courses in 5 Points, both through Hobart and William Smith colleges and through the Cornell Prison Education Program.
Okay.
And I wanted to continue with those classes because we were released mid-semester. I wanted to continue with those classes on the Ithaca campus through independent study, even though I wasn't going to get a Cornell bachelor's degree through these classes. It was Cornell working together with Cayuga Community College to offer an associate's degree in liberal arts. I still wanted to continue with my education with the professors and instructors from Cornell that I was taking classes with shortly after I was paroled. So the idea of going to Cornell University, seems like a quite a grand idea. And I for someone who's incarcerated for so long and who only has a GED, but I had worked in the law library for many, many years, and I had, devoted myself to legal writing. And I met a law professor from Cornell who actually had visited me at 5 Points, who encouraged me to apply. So I really took it seriously at that point that maybe this is something I should pursue. So eventually, how I got to Ithaca, to kind of fast forward, parole initially was going to send me to Brooklyn. I didn't go to Brooklyn. I had no residence there, so I wanted to go to Ithaca. That was not approved initially, and then a former city court judge in Ithaca told parole that he would allow me to stay at his residence for purposes of furthering my education and living in Ithaca. So when he did that, then parole was like, okay, if the judge is going to let him stay there, he can come to Ithaca. So I lived with the judge, Jim Kerrigan, for about 2 weeks. I ended up finding a job as a paralegal like the first week that I came home, and I ended up finding my own apartment by West Campus on Stewart shortly after. And I also was hired as a research assistant for the Cornell Center for the Study of the Death Penalty Worldwide. So I found myself working as a paralegal for a local attorney and also doing work for the death penalty clinic at Cornell Law School, which was a tremendous experience for me to meet so many great, lawyers and faculty from the law school and to get that research experience under my belt. That was awesome. And then I audited a class the fall of 2017. Now, I was also still continuing with the classes I had mentioned that I had started on the inside,
right,
through independent study, going to Goldwin Smith and meeting with the professor in his office and talking about Aristotle for 3 hours, and then coming out and not, it's different when you're in a classroom and you don't have to answer every question. Independent study is an entirely different beast. But it was fun, right? So that, and then I applied to go to Cornell to be a matriculating student at Cornell in this fall of 2017, and
which would, and then yes.
Yeah.
So you applied to matriculate the fall of 2017, and
yes.
We are now recording this in the spring of 2019.
Yeah.
Where we know from the beginning that you've taken certain classes. Where are we right now in Cornell in your academic climb towards graduation?
Well, I'm a first semester senior. I graduate in the spring. I graduate in December. I'll walk in December. I'm a government major. I plan to take the LSAT in September and to apply for law school at that time. And it's my dream to, become an attorney, and to, I think of people like Sean Hopwood and Dwayne Betts who've went from prison to, go on and obtain a law degree and become practicing lawyers. So kind of see them as role models for what I want to do.
I want to put a pin in that for 1 second. What is your brother up to?
My brother, he's a justice and education scholar at Columbia University. He also works for the Fortune Society as a case manager, connecting people who are released from prison to services down in the city area, whether it's through mental health or helping them find housing. Something he's passionate about and giving back to people who are released.
I'm going to ask the question that I know many people have probably asked you along the way. Would you have ever thought that a kid growing up in Brooklyn in the surroundings that you were surrounded by and the incidents that took place in the early part of your life would now be almost less than a year away from graduating from one of the finest institutions in the country?
Never in my life. And, Professor Margulies from the law school told me, take in this experience, enjoy it. Don't just go through the process. Take in everything Cornell has to offer, and I've been doing that. I've been trying my best to do that between the busyness of my schedule. My son, I have a beautiful son who was born in the middle of finals in 2018, May 10th. So his birthday had just passed. We just celebrated, had a big birthday party on Saturday. And my family came up from New York City and we celebrated here in Ithaca at Stewart Park, which was great. So between fatherhood, work, and taking a ton of classes at Cornell, I'm still trying to absorb everything and, enjoy this part of my life. I remember thinking back when I was 21 and 22, and I'd sit in a cell and think about, how I would never have that opportunity, how, maybe I blew it, right? Like I would, see commencement speakers on television every May talking to students who are graduating college, and it would be on the local news. And I would say, wow, I wish one day I could, don that cap and gown. Like, would it ever be real to me? And, I'm living that right now. So I try to pinch myself and remind myself where I was, just 2-3 years ago, not knowing if this opportunity would ever present itself to me. And, it's become a way for me to redeem myself, right?
Yeah.
My mother's like so proud of everything I've done. Like she went and sent the New York Times article I wrote to all of her friends. And, just to see her face when I was released, like waiting at the door with my brothers, it was a very emotional experience for me, knowing that they'd been there all those years. And to now say, look, I'm making them proud is, priceless.
Darnell, I want to thank you for 3 things. First of all, I want to thank you because your story was so captivating. This is without a doubt the least I've had to talk on this podcast. So I know our listeners are ecstatic because they didn't want to hear a lot from me. I want to thank you for sharing this unbelievable story that is yet to be unwritten. And I think I want to thank you personally for just sharing and explaining the level of maturity that you had to go through and what you must have had to deal with all these years, but to also have that sense of appreciation as that professor told you to take it all in.
Yeah.
I think our listeners who just heard this will do exactly the same. And I can't thank you enough for sharing this incredible story and only want to wish you continued success.
Thank you.
I don't want to go back and say what you'd wish or whatever it is, because obviously, you've got a family, you've got an education soon to be under your belt, and probably many more great things ahead of you. I just want you to continue to tell the story and call me up so that when, I want to find you, the guy that's going to make the movie of the YouTube, because I'm already in the back of my head saying, I got a couple of people we should be talking to. But when that story shows up on film, maybe we hang out and we go on the red carpet together. How about that?
Definitely. There's so much to the story that, I can't really give everyone in such a short time span, but it's so much to it, to that experience, to that journey. Again, it was 17 years, so you can only imagine.
In reality, it's hard to imagine, and I think what's even more impressive is how your perspective and the way that you look at things and the way that you're going through it. And I guess, like you said, so few get out of the correctional system beforehand for parole, and not only the ability to do it, but also to take advantage of it as you have. And I hope others are inspired by that story alone, all the way down to young kids in troubled neighborhoods, to those that are in prison and have to think about it. And what I share is obviously the community here, from the business community of those people in the professional world to the young alumni that are listening to this program as well. Hopefully we'll also gain an appreciation for these great programs that are going on as well, and continue to support them, because I think they're vital, because finding people like you to bring you to light is a pretty awesome experience. So thank you again.
Man. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Before we leave, though, I got to have a little fun with you, if that's okay with you.
No problem.
Because I think it would be fun. and I know we've got a certain perspective here, but are you a fan of the movies?
Yeah, I am a fan of the movies. I actually just seen Endgame with kind of. I was a comic book nerd when I was in the 90s, when people read comic books. So I had to watch Endgame, and I watched Game of Thrones, but that technically doesn't count as a movie.
It feels like a movie. I've been watching it every week as well. So I guess I would love to ask you, do you have an all-time favorite movie?
$1 Million Baby with Hilary Swank.
And why is that your favorite movie?
I like Morgan Freeman as an actor, and I thought that the acting was great, and I thought the story was very emotional, and I don't know, it just struck me as, her performance, Hilary Swank's performance in the movie was just amazing. Coming from the rural, family that she came from, and then suffering that injury in the ring, and the chemistry between her and Morgan Freeman was great throughout the movie, and it was one of it is my favorite movie of all. Believe it or not,
I totally believe it. It's great, and I want to say, I think those were 2 Oscars that they both got, and Clint Eastwood won it for whatever it was. I may have won Best Director too. So
Best Director, she definitely won Best Actress. I remember that.
Anyway, Darnell Epps, thank you for sharing your story, and continued success to you. Hey, good luck on your Spanish final, and
I have the government final tomorrow,
or whatever it might be, and obviously, and enjoy the last semester there, and make sure you really do take in everything. I like that bit of advice.
All right, thank you. Have a good one.
Gotcha. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us, and until next time, keep thriving onward and upward, and remember, be brief, be bright. Be gone.
You've been listening to Thrive Loud with your host, Lou Diamond. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Thrive Loud. Or find us on the web at thriveloud.com.